thank you all for being here tonight. I'm sorry that Ray isn't here instead of me, for your benefit. But I did want to step up because it was an important part of history, important part of my life. I've gone through this sedition trial. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in the 50s and came of age in the 60s. I was fortunate to be raised by parents who were opposed to slavery, opposed to racism, which was, you know, pretty prevalent in the area that I grew up. We would get soap in our mouth if we said anything racist, like we would if we said a bad word. I don't approve of that punishment anymore. But it was just that we grew up in a unique family given where we lived. And that meant that from the time I was a little kid in school, I was different in that sense because I guess I was always idealistic is the word, and believed in peace, and that we were all the same on the inside, and all of these things that my parents told me. I was also very patriotic. My father was in the Army all his life. My father was in World War II, and my brother ended up dying from exposure to Agent Orange after being a medevac in Vietnam for his 2 tours there. Part of being patriotic was believing in the Constitution. I remember being bored one summer day, and my mother said, "Go to the library and start reading." And it was a really teeny tiny library. It was in Del Mar, Maryland, but there were some good books there, and I did get turned on by reading things. And I remember reading The Rights of Man, and I was just really believed in change. And I remember saying, really young, saying, well, you know, if everybody just marries each other, we'd all be the same color, we wouldn't have the same problem anymore. And my parents said, Patty, don't say that to anybody anywhere. So it was kind of at that place, and then of course I grew up, which I think was fortunate, through a time of great illustration of rights and people fighting for rights and against racism and against the Vietnam War. I went out to California when I was 17. Shortly thereafter, I was hit by a car, and I woke up in a room with people crying. There was 3 other women in the room with me because Martin Luther King had just been killed. I got out after 2 months, and Bobby Kennedy was killed, and I ended up going back east and trying to work somewhere in Kent State had happened. And all of these things I felt very deeply, and they motivated me, and I knew that whatever I did, I wasn't going to sit here and type bills in this medical office anymore. I was going to do something. And I just continued to travel and go from place to place and finding whatever movement groups were in areas that I traveled to, in New York and in Boston. And I ended up in Maine in 1972 and hooked up with the people who were against the war in Vietnam, and were doing some other, I worked for the poverty program under Lyndon Johnson, and tried to organize in the poor neighborhoods in Maine, which there were many, many poor people in Maine. And then when Nixon told us the war was over, well, of course it wasn't true, and we got angry. We got, when protesting was good and marching was good, and but we just got angry by being lied to, and got educated about the role of corporations in war, about profit before people dying. My father had always told people that when he recruited people in the Army that they might get a trade because there were no jobs where I grew up, so people would go in the Army and get jobs, and then they would be killed in Vietnam. And so all of these things, I'm sure, contributed to me following the path and one day meeting Ray Lavasser. We went to work in prison reform in Maine, organized a group called SCAR, and that stood for the Statewide Correctional Association for Reform, something. But we had a newspaper, and we organized and had a bail fund, and worked with prisoners in Thomaston for the prison. And the ideas of prisons and the role of prisons in the country and how that's used to control people. It provides jobs for people, so it seems like there always has to be a steady group of prisoners who are always the poorest, and of course people of color, and disenfranchised people who didn't have lawyers that were able or willing to fight for them. And you know, so all these things radicalized me. And then then Ray and I eventually, we went underground and had 3 children and lived underground for a number of years. When I was arrested in Ohio in 1984, I was tried for harboring a fugitive, who was my husband. I was convicted and got a 5-year sentence. And then I was brought to, I did a little while in Alderson, West Virginia, and then I was brought to New York to be tried with everybody else in the Brooklyn case. And in Brooklyn, I mean, we had been taken around to prisons all over this country, and I guess you could say that if you just spend a little bit of time in prison, I spent 3 years, 4 months in prison, the balance of the 5 years on parole. It's an interesting experience. It's, you know, enriching as much as it was hard. And we were treated like terrorists, just like people have been calling us this. And so that meant we did a lot of isolation and a lot of more difficult time in prison than other people. We didn't have access to our legal papers. We had to always fight. To be represented by great lawyers was, of course, some great blessing that we had in life, and, you know, really saved us from a lot more pain and suffering that we would have gone through otherwise.